The groan was deep and ancient, a sound from the very bones of the earth. It was not the familiar rumble of a distant mammoth herd or the roar of a flash flood carving its way through the valley. This was a sound of stone giving way, of a mountain sighing its last breath. For the people of the Red Ochre clan, huddled in the mouth of their ancestral cave, it was the sound of their world breaking. Cale, a youth on the cusp of manhood, felt the vibration not in his ears but in his feet, a shudder that ran up his legs and settled as a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He scrambled to the entrance, his bare feet sure on the well-worn stone, and peered out into the gray twilight. The air was thick with a new, sharp smell, the scent of fractured flint and ancient dust. Across the narrow valley, a vast section of the opposing cliff face had sheared away, a pale, raw wound against the weathered gray rock. Tons of stone and earth had crashed down, partially blocking the river that was the lifeblood of their territory. But the true terror lay above them. A web of new cracks, thin as a spider's thread yet dark with menace, had spread across the ceiling of their home. A fine powder of rock dust drifted down, coating everything in a gritty film. Borin, the clan's chieftain, a man whose face was a map of hard-won seasons, ran a thick finger along one of the fissures. His jaw was tight. "The mountain is sick," he grunted, his voice a low rumble that did little to soothe the fear rippling through the 20 or so members of the clan. "The great fall has shaken its spirit. This place is no longer safe." His words, stark and absolute, fell like stones into a silent pool. The cave was more than a shelter. It was their history, their identity. The walls were smoothed by the passage of generations. The hearthstones in the center had been warmed by the fires of their grandfathers' grandfathers. To leave was to be torn from their roots, to become drifters on the cold wind. But the fine, persistent rain of dust from the ceiling was an argument no one could refute. Another tremor, another shift in the wounded mountain, and the roof would become their tomb. And so the search began. For days, the clan's hunters, Cale among them, ranged farther than they ever had before. They explored every rock outcropping, every fissure, every hollow that might offer sanctuary. The land, familiar and generous in the summer, had turned harsh and unwelcoming. The autumn rains were relentless, turning the valley floor into a muddy quagmire. The smaller caves they found were damp, cramped, or already occupied by cave bears or snarling hyenas, whose territorial claims were backed by formidable teeth and claws. Morale dwindled with each fruitless day. The children whimpered with cold and uncertainty. The elders, their faces etched with worry, huddled under hide blankets, their gazes often turning back towards the wounded mountain, towards the only home they had ever known. A gnawing anxiety began to settle over the clan. The first snows of winter were not far off. To be caught without shelter when the great white cold descended was a death sentence. Cale felt the weight of this desperation more than most. He was young, his muscles lean but strong, his spirit eager. He longed to prove his worth, to earn the right to hunt alongside seasoned men like Torg, a burly, taciturn hunter who saw Cale's thoughtful nature as a sign of weakness. While Torg relied on brute strength and a near-animal instinct, Cale was an observer. He noticed the subtle patterns in the flight of birds, the way the lichen grew differently on the north side of rocks, the faint tracks that others missed. It was this attentiveness that now led him away from the well-trodden paths of the valley floor. He remembered a story his grandmother used to tell, of a time of great drought when the river shrank, and the ancestors had found a hidden spring high up in the western cliffs, a place the hunters had never thought to look. While the others focused on the obvious shelters along the river, Cale's gaze was drawn upward, to the forbidding wall of limestone that formed the valley's western rim. It was a brutal climb, a treacherous ascent over slick, moss-covered rocks and through thorny, grasping shrubs. Torg had scoffed when Cale had declared his intention. "You chase sky spirits, boy. There is nothing but wind and eagles up there." But Cale was driven by a whisper of intuition, a feeling he could not explain. He pushed himself upward, his fingers and toes finding purchase in the smallest of cracks. The valley fell away below him, his clan a small, huddled group of fur-clad figures far beneath. He was alone, suspended between the earth and the sky, the wind his only companion. He found it near midday. It wasn't a cave mouth, not in the traditional sense. It was a flaw in the rock face, a dark, vertical slit almost completely obscured by a curtain of tangled, ivy-like vines. What drew his eye was the faintest puff of condensation, a misty exhalation from the rock that spoke of a deep, inner space with a different temperature than the outside air. It was a cave breathing. His heart hammered against his ribs. He tore at the tough, woody vines, his fingers raw and bleeding, until he had cleared an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. He paused at the threshold, a wave of apprehension washing over him. To enter the unknown belly of the earth alone was to court dangers unseen. But the thought of his clan, of the coming snows, pushed him forward. He took a piece of fat-soaked moss and a flint striker from the pouch at his belt, and with a few sharp blows, coaxed a small, flickering flame to life on the end of a dry branch. He slid through the narrow opening, his torch held out before him. The air inside was still and cold, carrying a scent he had never encountered before, the smell of utter antiquity, of dust that had not been disturbed for 1,000 seasons, of a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. The narrow passage, slick with moisture, opened abruptly into a vast, cavernous chamber. Cale gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The chamber was immense, its ceiling lost in a cathedral of darkness far above the reach of his flickering torchlight. Great columns of stone, like the petrified legs of giants, rose from the floor to meet icicles of rock dripping from the ceiling. The space was utterly empty, utterly silent, a perfect, untouched sanctuary. It was dry, defensible, and large enough to house their clan 10 times over. A wave of triumphant relief washed over him. He had found it. He had found their new home. He began to explore, his torch casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. He walked deeper into the cavern, his soft-shod feet making no sound on the dusty floor. He rounded a massive pillar of stone and stopped dead, his eyes widening in disbelief. The wall was not bare. The flickering light of his torch fell upon a creature of breathtaking vitality. A great bull bison, its head lowered in a charge, its shaggy mane rendered in strokes of deep, earthy red and black. Its muscles seemed to bulge from the rock, its single, furious eye, drawn with a masterful economy of line, seemed to stare directly at him. It was not a drawing. It was the spirit of a bison, captured in pigment and stone. Stunned, Cale lifted his torch higher. The bison was not alone. The entire wall was a canvas, a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of the animal world. There were herds of wild horses, their manes flying, their bodies a symphony of motion. There were deer, delicate and graceful, their heads turned as if startled by his light. There were massive, woolly mammoths, their great, curved tusks sweeping upwards, their sheer bulk conveyed by the clever use of the rock's natural bulges and curves. He moved as if in a dream, his torch revealing one marvel after another. He saw a pride of cave lions, lean and hungry, stalking a group of unsuspecting ibex. He saw a woolly rhinoceros, its head a fortress of horn and bone. And interspersed among the animals were symbols he did not understand, grids of dots, strange, feathered lines, and, most chillingly, handprints. There were dozens of them, stenciled in red and black ochre. They were the hands of men, women, and even children. They were negative images, created by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it. They were ghostly signatures, a declaration across an unimaginable gulf of time. We were here. Cale felt a profound sense of awe, a feeling so powerful it was almost religious. This was not just a cave. This was a sacred place. The people who had made these images were his people, his distant, forgotten ancestors. They had walked the same land, hunted these same beasts, felt the same wind on their faces. They had come into this deep, silent darkness and, with fire and crushed rock, had left behind their souls. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold wall beside one of the handprints, placing his own hand next to the ghostly outline. His hand was warm with life. The stone was cold with the memory of it. For a long, silent moment, he felt a connection, a bridge across the abyss of time. He was not just Cale of the Red Ochre clan. He was a link in a chain that stretched back into the deep, misty past, a past he had never known existed. He found another chamber, deeper still. This one was different. The animals here were more than just depictions. A great cave bear was drawn over a natural hollow in the rock, and its body was pockmarked with dozens of small holes. Cale realized with a start that the holes were spear marks. The ancestors had not just painted the bear. They had ritually hunted it on the wall. It was a place of magic, of ritual, a place where the world of spirits and the world of flesh intertwined. Here, too, he found a figure that made him recoil in shock. It was not fully animal nor fully human. It had the legs of a man, the body of a bison, the antlered head of a stag, and the wide, staring eyes of an owl. The figure was dancing, its arms raised in a powerful, commanding gesture. A shaman, a spirit walker, a master of the hunt, a speaker to the gods. This was the artist, the magician who had orchestrated this entire subterranean world. Time ceased to have meaning. Cale wandered for what felt like hours, his torch burning low, his mind reeling with the implications of his discovery. This cave was not just a shelter. It was a story, a library of stone, a temple of memory. The knowledge contained on these walls, the secrets of the hunt, the rhythms of the seasons, the beliefs of the ancestors, was a treasure beyond imagining. The dying flame of his torch finally brought him back to reality. He had to go back. He had to tell the others. But how could he explain this? How could he put into words the overwhelming sense of wonder, the feeling of touching the sacred? He made his way back to the entrance, his heart a turmoil of excitement and anxiety. He squeezed through the narrow opening and into the fading light of day. The world outside seemed drab and colorless compared to the vibrant, secret world he had just left. He scrambled down the cliff face, his movements reckless with urgency. When he reached the valley floor, he was gasping for breath, his clothes torn, his hands and face smudged with dirt and ancient ochre. He burst into the anxious circle of his clan. "I have found it!" he cried, his voice hoarse. "A shelter, a great cave dry and safe." A murmur of relief and excitement went through the clan. Borin clasped his shoulder, a rare smile cracking his stern face. "You have done well, Cale. You have a hunter's eye after all. Let us." But Cale shook his head. "It is more than a shelter," he said, struggling for the words. "It is a place of spirits. The ancestors, they are there. They have left their story on the walls." Torg let out a contemptuous snort. "The boy has been addled by the climb. He sees ghosts in the shadows. A cave is a cave. It is rock and darkness, nothing more. Let's see this great shelter." Borin, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "Show us, Cale. The clan must see for itself." With a heavy heart, Cale led the way. He knew that Borin would see a dry place to build a fire. Torg would see defensible walls. They would see a cave. He prayed that at least one of them, perhaps Alara, the clan's oldest woman, the keeper of the stories, would be able to see what he had seen. The whispering shadows of their own past, waiting for them in the heart of the earth. As he led them towards the hidden fissure, he wondered if he had found a home for his people, or if he had unleashed a power that would change them forever. The clan's entry into the great cave was a hesitant, fearful affair. They shuffled through the narrow passage, their torches casting a weak, flickering light that seemed to be swallowed by the immense, hungry darkness. The children clung to their mother's legs, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. The hunters held their spears at the ready, their gazes darting into the shadowy corners, expecting beasts that were not there. Borin was the first to enter the main chamber. He held his torch high, his pragmatic eyes sweeping the vast, dark space. He grunted in satisfaction. "It is good," he declared. his voice echoing strangely in the immense silence. Dry, deep. The entrance is narrow, we can defend it easily. We will build our hearth here. He pointed to the center of the chamber, his mind already on the practicalities of turning this cavern into a home. For him, it was a magnificent, empty vessel. Then Torg and the other hunters emerged, their initial apprehension giving way to a grudging respect for the sheer size of the place. It is a good cave, Torg admitted, his eyes on the high, dark ceiling. No bear would dare make its den in a place so vast. The boy was lucky. But Kale watched Alara, the old woman, her face a web of deep-set wrinkles. Her back bent with the weight of her years, did not stop in the center. She moved slowly, her ancient eyes adjusting to the gloom. She let her gnarled hand trail along the wall, her touch as light as a moth's wing. Her gaze followed the path of her hand, and as her torchlight fell upon the first of the great painted bulls, she stopped. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Her hand, which had seen the tanning of 1,000 hides and the preparation of 1,000 meals, reached out but did not touch the painting. It hovered inches from the wall, her fingers trembling slightly. The other clan members, noticing her strange behavior, fell silent and gathered behind her. One by one, their torches illuminated the magnificent fresco. A collective intake of breath rippled through the clan. They saw the bison, the horses, the mammoths. They saw the raw power, the captured motion, the impossible life that bloomed from the cold stone. This was not the idle scratching of a child. This was the work of masters, of magicians. The ancestors, Alara whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that silenced even Torg's skepticism. They speak to us. In the days that followed, the cave was transformed. The Red Ochre clan made it their home. They built a large, circular hearth in the center of the main chamber, its fire a warm, beating heart in the cavern's cold body. The smoke found its way out through unseen fissures in the high ceiling, creating a constant, hazy veil in the upper darkness. They established sleeping areas, workspaces for toolmaking and hide scraping, and a storage area for their food. Life, which had been precarious and uncertain, found a new, stable rhythm. But the paintings were a constant, silent presence. They were the first thing the people saw when they woke in the fire's glow, and the last thing they saw before they slept. They were a source of endless fascination and deep, unsettling mystery. The cave was a home, but it was also a temple, and this duality began to subtly change the fabric of the clan. Kale and Alara became the keepers of the walls. Every day, they would take torches and explore the painted galleries, their silent communion an object of curiosity for the rest of the clan. Alara, the repository of the clan's oral history, found echoes of her stories in the images on the stone. "See here," she said one day, pointing to a panel depicting a line of deer all facing the same direction. "My grandmother told of the Great Walk, when the herds moved north for 7 suns, and the people followed. This is that story. The ancestors did not let it die with their breath. They gave it to the stone, so it would never be forgotten." Kale, with his keen, observant eyes, began to see not just stories, but patterns. "Look, Alara," he said, tracing a finger in the air before a series of symbols next to a painting of a salmon. "This symbol, the wavy line, it is here. And it is here by the river in this hunting scene. And here again where the women are gathering reeds. It means water, the river." It was a staggering realization. The symbols were not just random marks. They were a form of writing, a language of ideas. The walls were not just a gallery. They were a book. Together, the old woman's wisdom and the young man's insight began to unlock the secrets of the cave. They discovered a panel in a remote side chamber that was a veritable map of the seasons. It showed the sun's position in the sky, the different phases of the moon, and the animals that were most abundant during each period. There were fish for the spring melt, bison for the summer plains, red deer for the autumn rut, and mammoths for the deep winter. It was a guide to survival, a calendar of stone that promised to regulate their lives and fill their bellies. Torg and the other hunters, initially dismissive, could not argue with the results. Following the guidance of the seasonal map, they found the herds where the paintings said they would be. Their hunts became more successful. Their stores of meat grew, and the fear of starvation that had been their constant companion began to recede. A grudging respect for Kale and his wall-gazing began to grow within the clan. The most profound discovery, however, came during a time of crisis. A sickness, a fever of the lungs, swept through the clan. It struck the children and the elderly the hardest. They had remedies: willow bark for fever, moss poultices for wounds, but this sickness was stubborn and deadly. Desperate, Kale searched the cave, believing that a people who possessed such knowledge of hunting must also have possessed knowledge of healing. In a small, almost hidden alcove, far from the grand galleries of the great beasts, he found a different kind of painting. The images here were smaller, more detailed. They were plants. He recognized some of them instantly: the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant, the bell-shaped flowers of the lungwort. Next to each plant was a series of symbols. One recurring symbol was of a person lying down, and another was of the same person standing up. With a jolt of understanding, Kale realized what he was looking at. A medical text, a record of healing herbs. He and Alara carefully identified the plants depicted on the wall. They showed a drawing of a plant with small yellow flowers next to the symbol for a coughing person. Alara recognized it as a weed that grew near the river. They had always ignored it. Now, following the silent instructions of the ancestors, they gathered it, brewed it into a bitter tea, and gave it to the sick. The effect was not instantaneous, but within a few days the fevers began to break. The coughing subsided. The sick began to recover. The clan had been saved, not by a spear, but by a picture on a wall. The cave had given them its deepest secret: the power not only to take life, but to preserve it. This event cemented the cave's sacred status. It was now understood to be a place of immense power and wisdom. The clan's relationship with it deepened. They began to leave their own offerings at the foot of the painted walls: a particularly fine flint point, a string of polished river stones, the first flower of spring. But it was the hunting rituals that underwent the most significant change. Alara and Kale had long been puzzled by the spear marks that riddled the paintings of the great beasts. Now they understood. Before a major hunt, the clan would gather before the great fresco of the mammoths or the bison. The hunters, led by Kale, would reenact the hunt in the flickering torchlight. They would chant the names of the animals, their voices echoing in the vast chamber, a symphony of supplication and respect. They would throw their spears, not at living flesh, but at the painted images, their points striking the stone with a sharp crack. They were not just practicing. They were performing magic. They were ensuring the success of the hunt in the world of spirits before they attempted it in the world of flesh. They were communing with the ancestors, asking for their strength, their luck, their blessing. Torg, once the ultimate pragmatist, now participated with a fervent intensity, understanding that the spear point was only as good as the spirit that guided it. One evening, as the clan sat around the warm, crackling fire, their bellies full from a successful bison hunt, Alara turned to Kale. Her eyes, which held the wisdom of generations, were clear and bright. "The ancestors gave us this gift," she said, her gaze sweeping across the shadowed walls. "But a gift must be returned. A story must be continued, or it dies." Kale understood. The cave was not a static museum. It was a living record, and their chapter was missing. He spent the next day grinding hematite into a fine red powder and mixing it with animal fat and cave water. He burned a stick of pine until it was a perfect charcoal point. That night, when the clan was asleep, he took a torch and went to a large, empty section of the wall near the entrance. He paused for a moment, the weight of the act settling upon him. He was about to add his voice to the chorus of the ancestors. He was about to speak across time. With a steady hand, he began to draw. He did not draw a single, magnificent beast. He drew his clan. He drew Borin, strong and steadfast. He drew Torg, his spear raised in triumph. He drew the women, butchering the meat, their hands skilled and sure. He drew the children, their faces alight with joy. And in the center, he drew the great, roaring fire of their hearth, the heart of their new home. Above them all, he drew the outline of the cave itself, a protective, embracing presence. Finally, he knelt down. He placed his hand on the wall and, using a hollow bone, blew a fine mist of black charcoal around it, leaving his own ghostly signature among the images of his people. He had not just created a picture. He had woven their story into the greater story of the cave. He had honored the past, captured the present, and left a message for the future. He was no longer just Kale, the boy who had found a cave. He was a story keeper, a link in the great, unbroken chain. The whispering shadows of the past now had a new voice, and the cave, their home, was complete.